All right, welcome everyone to our third and final session of our third day at Lead Generation World London Virtual. Welcome to this session. We've got a great one lined up, and this one's really interesting because in the world of voice, Alexa and Siri and all these other things, it's really interesting to hear how marketers are utilizing these tools to create leads and create interest in their products. And it's a new frontier. So I'm really excited to welcome Kenneth Kinney. He is the host of the Shark's Perspective and an avid diver and shark enthusiast. Around the industry, we call him the Shark, not for bad reasons, only good reasons. And so I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Kenneth and let him take it from here. But Kenneth, welcome.
Good day, Michael. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm coming to you live from the virtual beach, but it'll do under the current circumstances. So, looking forward to talking about this topic. It's one that's near and dear to me. I got to speak about it before at Lead Generation World in person before. So, for that being said, let me cue up the PowerPoint so I could drive us through this. And here we go. All right. So again, welcome to Lead Generation World. We're going to talk about how to leverage voice for lead generation, something I've really been diving into since I worked on the brand side and now that I work on the consulting and agency side as well. But so much of the conversation obviously gets swallowed up by what's going on with Amazon and Alexa devices and Google and home devices. But I really wanted to take a look at the type of leveraging audio for different types of audiences as well. So as we know, there are different types of learners, and a lot of those leverage visual, kinesthetic, reading, writing, interpersonal, or auditory. So obviously we're going to focus a lot on ways to trigger buyers from an auditory level, and auditory learners, especially those that just consume content that's often heard or spoken. So audio is experiencing a boom, and you may have seen these stats before, but a third of the population has reported listening to a podcast in the last month. That's a lot of listeners. We saw podcast listening take a significant dip during the first part of the pandemic, but it's since rebounded a lot. 67% of the people have listened to online audio has doubled since 2012. That continues to grow. 50% of the population here in the States that has listened to audiobooks listened to one the first time, and now that's continuing to grow. And a lot of the population is diversifying with ages as well, and the types of people that listen. But so the first one I really want to jump into is looking at your sonic brand. And the reason I do this in particular, and I'm not going to go into too much of a branding perspective of taking this, but when you think of companies like Xbox, and you think of the sounds that they emit, or you think of Farmers Insurance, famous one here that runs commercials nonstop, or if you think of Intel, and I'll give you Intel as an example. So that little minor tone, and Xbox has one, Farmers has a jingle on their insurance. But if you think of those kind of tones and where you can employ that form of audio, one way I've done it with some consulting engagements is leveraging it. And sorry, I do the same thing with my own podcast, where when you think of my podcast, you think of sharks, rather, you think of the tune from Jaws. But where you can really leverage this from a lead generation standpoint to help from a conversion standpoint, just like when you think of conversion rate optimization in general with web pages or landing pages, it's leveraging that audio and putting it in an IVR format. So when a customer calls in, if they're going through your call center or listening to interact in some complex way that's outside of e-commerce, literally taking something like the Intel tone, and when somebody calls in and they press 1 or 2 for sales or whatever the number is, then they hear it right before that. When that moment when they can hear that bum 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 sound before it goes to audio, it acts like an additional trigger. And it's not an end all, but it's another way to prompt your audience, to put them in the mood, for lack of a better phrase, to getting to where they're ready to be more familiar with that trusted brand, and sale. This happens all the time with call centers, to where you call in, you press a number, you wait for the call center agent to pick up, and it can take some time for them to pick up, and you're listening to music, for example, or something that doesn't make sense. So this is where you have the opportunity to really help tell an additional audio story, if you will, even in a short form, that helps prompt them to get ready to understand and be more comfortable with your brand. Next, let's dive into podcasting. So, again, this is where the numbers were a year ago. And I didn't update this slide because I thought it was pretty funny. There were 800,000 podcast shows as of 2019 with 30 million episodes. That number exploded to over around 2 million. It was the last research numbers I heard. 2 million podcast shows that were out there sitting, you could go download. Now, less than 50% of those were active. So brands have, when considering something like podcasting, really have to think about how to be consistent. But it is such a gold mine. I've been doing podcasting for over a decade, having been on radio before. I turned a radio show into also a podcast that I used 10 years ago. I've been on my show for 3 years. But again, even in that format, it's still a very new format that people aren't consistently sticking to for multiple years like they do in TV and radio. Podcasting revenue is expected to exceed $1 billion. And again, this is a forecast from last year, that it was 2018 self-reported revenue, and the forecasted numbers continue to be adjusted over and over again for podcast revenue this year in 2021. That has since even exploded again because so many people were trying to figure out where to put their money when they couldn't go to trade shows like Lead Generation World. Since we're not having booths in London, where's the digital way that I can take and put that money? And so this has been an exciting frontier, including for me. So is podcasting a niche community? No. Monthly podcast numbers have exploded over the years, and this trend continues, with the exception of 2020 numbers, which dipped and then have since risen back up. The numbers in the US, which again are a pretty good indicator compared to even in England, the numbers have continued to grow as we emerge out of the pandemic and people are out and about. Audio listening has continued to um, go higher and higher here. Again, the reason why these numbers stop at 2019 is because there was a dip in 2020 and the numbers start to show back up. The podcast listeners who've purchased an item, as we develop those communities, have really grown with the number of listeners, daily listeners, weekly listeners. And where we are with podcasting in particular is people are becoming more and more familiar with the idea of podcasting. This is not exactly something that you have to always only explain to your grandmother what it is or explain to your mother what it is. Now we're starting to get to a place where a majority of the adult population in the Western world is familiar with podcasting. China is doing amazing things in podcasting, and it's killing it there. So we're actually behind a lot of the Asian markets as well. So first of all, you've really got to decide on the kind of strategy as to whether or not you're going to host your own podcast or not. So when I talk about this from a branding standpoint, the before and the after is basically whether or not before, are you going to decide to have your own kind of show? Is it going to be your branded show with your logo on it? And if you do that, then you've got to understand that there's just a lot of promotion that you have to do because you have to do this across channels. So when looking at a podcasting at first, you really got to look at whether or not you go uh, podcasting yourself and the work that it entails after, or are you going to start your own show? So here's a question. Do you have to be podcasting? Do you have to have your own branded podcast? If you were XYZ brand, do you necessarily need to have the, again, XYZ podcast? Well, false. And I use this from Jurassic Park. The question is, yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should. Now, the reason I say this is because that so many people are wanting to jump in to this channel, but most podcasts don't last beyond 7 episodes. They're for most that's the reason I mentioned earlier why there are 2 million podcasts out there. shows, but less than 50% of them are active. So, but when you're creating trust as a brand, you don't have the capability of just running out there and testing every idea that could be sticky and then let it drop. From a personal brand standpoint, it's even bad. I know a lot of friends who I've been disappointed with who started podcasts because they were eager to jump in, and then it sort of went away, and then it kind of stuck that they let it quit. So when you do that with a brand, it's obviously amplified that much more because it's probably going to be embedded in your social post or email. And so when you start doing this, really look at forming that kind of commitment. So do you have to start your own podcast? No, you can leverage just as much, especially from a brand standpoint. And I recognize this having worked for a brand and then now developing my own personal brand. You can get as much SEO out of this, if not more, by appearing on a lot of other podcasts. The real issue is you've got to decide on that level of commitment you have to podcasting. Are you a brand that podcasts, or are you a podcasting brand? So really understanding whether or not you want to be out in the podcasting world, yes, but do you have to start your own podcast? Do that? Absolutely not. Is it difficult to get great guests? Yes, it is. Not everybody wants to hear every buddy on your accounting team or your customer support team or your whatever your field expert is. They don't want to hear your logo every moment. What they want to hear is personal stories. But if you want to think of it somewhat like with guest blogging, you can find great guests even to be on your show. Even if you are Bob's accounting shop, you can grab great guests to come on to your show as well and tell stories if you're in something like an interview format. Really, what you want to hone in on, whether it's your employees or somebody you're inviting externally to the show, is that they've got to be able to tell great stories to amplify. But there are a lot of companies and resources, as you probably know. One friend of mine, Tom Schwab, has Interview Valet. They're in the business of helping you find the targeted podcast or the targeted guest to fit your brand. So Tom's one of the guys that out there that is really catering. If you are looking for people to be on your show, they can help find you those kind of folks. So should you blog about it? Absolutely. Again, podcasting and audio shouldn't live in one silo. When you have the opportunity to talk about it, this doesn't have to just be a transcript. This could be write about the fact that you were on a podcast, that one of your people, one of your employees was on somebody else's podcast. Make certain that you leverage that in a blog form as well as you can. Talk about the podcast interview, encourage your guests to write about it. It doesn't necessarily need to be just on your own personal blog for your brand. It can also be on somebody else's blog. Lee Oden, who runs Top Rank Marketing, was on my show. He's one of the top influencers. And I remember how well they did from an SEO standpoint. He talks about it on his own blog. He wrote his own blog, independent of me, didn't ask me for anything other than the artwork. They wrote a great blog about his interview with me. And they do this with a lot of the different podcasts that they come on. And that's why they rank extremely high from an SEO standpoint. I wrote about it on my previous website, but I was so impressed that he wrote it as well. And they used it in other campaigns that I saw on social. SAP also does this. SAP talks about the experience that one of their senior directors of VPs was on my show, and she wrote about it within their company newsletter that reached something like, I forget what the number was. It was well north of 100,000 people, employees, internal and external, went worldwide. But in their digital magazine, their digital property, they wrote about being on my show. And I thought that was great. It was amazing to see someone else, again, leverage that kind of content, not just sitting in one narrow audio channel only. So podcasting content is king. No, it's not. And I be careful how you may be sold with as you get into this, that you don't overthink the podcast strategy. It's another looking at audio as an overall holistic view as opposed to just podcasting is really important. So podcasting is not expensive. Sorry, I jumped that slide. Podcasting is expensive. No, it's not. It's not expensive. This microphone and most good microphones are going to be anywhere from $400 to less. You can get a ATR 2100 for $100. It's a fantastic microphone that Audio Technica makes. costs you very little to do a Zoom call. 99% of the time is going to be free. You can separate out the audio. You can do much higher end stuff, but even Rodecaster pros are roughly $600 to port your sound into as a mixer. So one of the things I always encourage somebody to spend money on is at least spend a little bit of money on a good microphone, but you don't have to break the bank, if you will. This was something I put together that just shows some general things. I left out the Rodecaster in particular because when you think about the basic things you need, a lot of this you're going to have your own computer. You know, if you're already just going to put it on your website, you probably already have that. But your microphone's going to a decent microphone's going to be anywhere from $50 to $400. You can get audio editing software like Audacity for free. GarageBand is another one that people use. There are more that will do even greater things, but the level of difference in your audio is not that much different if you get um, audio that when you record it is not overly compressed. So when you can record audio to your hard drive, that makes a big difference as well. But the little things like memory cards, backup recorders, a lot of these music and sound effects, they're nominal that you can start for your own brand. It's just something you want to consider if you're starting up your own podcast. So, what you do have to think about, though, especially with audio and with podcasting, is you do sort of have to think about your brand as a publisher. Are you creating the types of audio content that you think people want to actually come back and consume just because you're involved or your logo's on top of it? And that's a very tough thing for a lot of marketers and advertisers to understand, because I know there are very few brands that I wake up to in the morning, jump on social media and say, I can't wait to hear what Coca-Cola has to tell me, or General Motors, or most other brands. I mean, for me, it's something about sharks or maybe the UFC, but you've really got to think like a publisher so that you encourage people to want to consume your audio. You've got to basically create, and a friend of mine who wrote Podcasting for Dummies basically wrote the quote that says, don't publish content that sucks. And this is extremely important when you think of it from an audio standpoint, because you've got a single ear to listen to. This is not a necessarily a multitasking type platform, but it really is important with podcasting, because it is something, if you create your own podcast, you get to control really all of it. So you should podcast only once a week. No, I've podcasted as many as 4 times and 5 times a week. Most of the time I podcast once, but I post when I see that there is an appetite or an amazing story that I need to tell. I know there was an occasion where I posted 4 of the top 10 influencers in all the marketing. I published them all within the week. They weren't going to be consumed all within that week. They were going to be consumed and crawl, because I had transcripts out there through long periods of time. They've continued to crawl. So you don't necessarily have to worry about what somebody else is doing. It is the Wild West. It's what your audience wants from your brand. Some ideas on publishing frequency, though, is to consider if you're doing a daily show. Know that not everybody wants to listen to a 2-hour show that you have to talk about every day. But if you're doing something really, really short, you could do it daily easily. If you're doing something, every week or every other week, I recommend 30 minutes to an hour. If you're doing anything beyond monthly, it's not really a podcast. It's just a bad hobby. So you should set a schedule. Yeah, absolutely. Because as you create audio content, whether you're selling something or not, but whether you're creating audio content that somebody wants to buy, you need to set a schedule to where they know when to find you. That could be Tuesday at 3 o'clock when you post a new podcast every week, or it could be Thursday at 11:48 at midnight. Condition your audience just like you would any kind of targeted ads, if you will, to know what to expect when you're going to drop an episode. People want to hear from you. They want, if you're creating this and they're subscribing, they don't want to be left guessing as to when you're going to podcast. So podcasts for a brand have to be branded. Big false. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. I think the really important thing is you've got to be able to create your story, which is not necessarily a logo on top of a story. Is your story of your brand something that people want to consume and that they'll remember, that's not just vanilla? I mean, I've got a cinnamon dolce today, and it's not just cinnamon, it's cinnamon dolce. I don't know why I got that one today, but when you think of it that way, excuse me, when you think of it that way, you've got to be able to remember that if you're consuming something and your audience can go get it from anywhere else, your audio story needs to be something that when you cut the logo out of it, it's still you. It's still your story. They know that it's you and your story. So you really have to challenge yourself to be able to tell an amazing story that's all you. So let me give you a couple of examples. One of them, just to think of it from a marketing and branding standpoint, is generic aspirin versus Bayer aspirin. Now, Bayer has invested tens of millions of dollars in creating brand equity and trust, and you know it's their story. It's the same reason that dummies like me will pay more for the exact same thing than in a generic equivalent. And so when you think of it, when you think of Bayer, for example, you don't necessarily, you could cut the logo out. I'm still looking for Bayer. I'm not only looking for generic aspirin. However, my wife is still the smarter one. She buys the generic. So is it a great place to sell? And I think about this, especially from a direct response standpoint. No. And I will tell you that as a listener and having spoken with a lot of listeners about this, this is very important that you figure out what is the right way to take advantage of how you can sell. And you can sell, it's just not a great direct response channel. People don't want to listen to a 30-minute show so that you can sell them on all your features and benefits that we've argued against in most marketing and advertising over and over again. So make certain you consider that. Stop to think, is this the kind of content that people want to listen to, absorb, share, comment about on social and more? So let me give you a couple examples that are fascinating. A friend of mine that I met actually at a TV conference, he works for one of the major stations, was the producer of the show called The Perfect Scam, which is an AARP, for people 50 and over. And this guy was not 50 and over. Will was probably 35 when he was working on this. This is a show that he did with Frank Abagnale, who is the famed uh, crook turned uh, FBI informant, and he was the guy that was the star of, basically his story was the star of Catch Me If You Can with Leonardo DiCaprio. Well, Will and Frank did this show called The Perfect Scam, where they weave through some amazing stories about identity theft and all kinds of things that people would be, kidnapping, call centers in foreign countries, trying to scam people out of money, all kinds of things like that. And in between there, they would weave in some, hey, join AARP. Their membership skyrocketed because of this, and it is a brilliant show. Will is no longer part of the show, but Frank Abagnale is, and it's been a really, really good show. On Life and Land was something that was done here that was to spoke to farmers, and the Farm Bureau did this, and it was fantastic because it really told the stories of farmers. Suicide rate, for example, is extremely high. Mental health issues very high with farmers out in the open in the middle of the night. It's a tough business, a lot of pressure. And they didn't just do a hairless sell, or sorry, this is John Deere. John Deere didn't do it just to sell a lot of tractors. They did it to tell a lot of stories that really pulled in that emotional element that we look for in marketing. So content is only for nonfiction. No, the message was one that was started by GE years ago. That was a story about outer space, and then they did another one with Life After, which again was fantastic. This was a fictional podcast. Then this was sort of the inspiration for SAP's Searching for Salai, which won a lot of best content podcast awards 2 years ago at Content Marketing Institute for their podcast of the year and project of the year. Again, it's a fictional story the about an intern who comes back through time and says that he was the intern for Leonardo da Vinci. Almost said Leonardo DiCaprio, but he was the um, intern for Leonardo da Vinci. And he tells this whole story, and there's no ads through this until the very end. Now, SAP did this and saw fantastic results. But what they did is they had a product called Leonardo that they introduced at the same time. So this was basically a companion piece to help people talking about it. And honestly, it was a really good show. It was very similar to more like a crime drama than it was what you would typically think of. But it had the brought to you by SAP. Was a big fan of the way GE and SAP, who've been highly recognized for the way they've done podcasts, different than the way most of us think of doing just a podcast with here I am talking about myself, or here I am talking to somebody else, and here's a bunch of commercials throughout. So I think this is sort of what I think of as a mission impossible challenge for most marketers is can you tell a story that illustrates your brand's product or service without under any circumstances mentioning your company or making a sales pitch. This is hard for us to do in the lead generation world, but don't not forcing your message, really pulling that story can draw a lot of customers in and let the story illustrate the features and benefits. Don't demonize your competition, just provide real value and thought leadership and not make a sales pitch. So again, fictional audio dramas are those dramas that are purely acoustic performances. It gives you the ability, like searching for Saleh, to do something different that you wouldn't think of, like you might with Bob's Accounting Shop. Maybe you tell the story of an accountant versus here's the best practices with, last in, first out. I mean, these kind of things can be told with much more original stories. So an exit strategy is needed. This is why I talk about podcasting in particular. You got to make a commitment to your audience. And if that commitment is through 10 episodes or it's ongoing for a year or it's going to be indefinite, great. Just make the commitment to yourself, to the people that listen to your show. Really understand that from an audio standpoint, your brand's leadership to yourself, you're going to stick with this kind of content. There's a formula for making a hip show? Absolutely not. There's not a rinse, wash, repeat, or everybody be doing it. It takes a lot of advertising. It takes a lot of great content storytelling. It takes a great community. Have an entire show to grab them. No, last thing people want to hear or see is another 30-second ad on a show. You've really got to pull people in to that. So understanding what your hook is for getting them to listen to your great story is really important. Most important person is the listener. And this applies for all audio, including podcasting. Not at all. So I'm going to jump to a story that nearly 1 in 5 people here in the US have a disability. And I didn't pull up the numbers specifically for England or Europe. But as reported, basically 1 in 5 people here in the US consume content in a different way. That doesn't mean that everybody's deaf and can't hear it. But I'll tell you a story about a friend of mine who was she was on America's Got Talent back in 2017, and Simon Cowell gave her the golden buzzer. So at least that was a good Simon Cowell tie-in to you, Brits. But Mandy is a singer. She's deaf. She lost her hearing when she was in college. She's a very sweet person, been a friend of mine for quite a few years. And she went on stage and floored everybody with her beautiful voice, got a golden buzzer, and she almost won the show. She lost to this girl who did puppets, and it was disturbing, but that's another story. So Mandy was on my show. We brought her on to talk about personal branding, her story, and all that good stuff. It basically became sort of a technology and audio enablement disability story, if you will. So she was on episode 160 with me, and she can communicate when you think of Zoom. Uh, uh, Google's got some functions on it. You can translate through a lot of different apps now, but it became how she can consume content as somebody that can't hear. And so when you think of that audio, and not just the people that are disabled, but this is also obviously applies to Google. Transcribe your podcast and audio content. It doesn't have to be for just a podcast. It'd be for anything you do that's audio. Make certain you turn that transcription, even if it's a show hide on your website, like I do mine, or if you put it specifically in a blog, make sure certain that it's one, crawlable to make Google happy, and two, make certain that people that can't consume content the same way are able to access it. What that'll also do for people like Mandy that I bring up all the time is it turns people like that into people with real purchasing ability. It helps them hear, yes, or it helps them rather be able to consume that content. But what it also does is it shows that audience, that 1 in 5 who may consume something differently than you and me, that they are going to become more empowered, more enabled, and more impassion with your brand, because those are the kind of super fans that you'll also create. People that know that you're doing something to help them become to reach content to make that more accessible. There's so many. That's a whole other conference presentation we could do at another time. But really think about that from the audience standpoint and from Google. Basic companies that you can use. Rev owns Timmy. Timmy and Otter are AI. They're very cheap. Get you anywhere from 60 to 80% correct. You can go back in and edit any audio content. Doesn't have to be a podcast. You got a 1 minute commercial and want a transcription, drop it in, you'll get it in a minute or two. I mean, it doesn't take very long at all. I do most of my 30, 45 minute shows. I get them back in, 5, 10 minutes. Rev.com, if you want to pay basically $1 a minute, something like that will allow you to upload the audio and it gets transcribed in 24 hours in near perfect transcription. And again, Skype I brought up because Skype allows you one of the basic platforms that will allow you to do transcriptions while we're live talking. So just making that more compliant and more, again, I'm not even eliminating Google. I'm just saying that compliance is a big piece. Google's a side wonderful benefit that helps make that content more crawlable. Uh, One thing to think about with audio content as well. Again, I leverage the 2019 statistics in particular for a reason, but it's so much more quicker now that when you think about taking this audio content, whether it's podcasts or anything else, there's benefits that your audience is recognizing that it's easier than going to a website or an app and reading through a bunch of content. I think about this all the time. I've got a friend who was one of the co-authors for Digital Marketing for Dummies. He'll go in a podcast all day long. What he doesn't want to do is write an 800 word or better blog. And who can blame him? He can jump on the phone for an hour and you're done. This is the same thing for people listening and consuming today, and that's why audio is another reason why audio is experiencing such a boom. Podcasts can be amazing companion pieces. This is not supposed to be just about podcasting, but I brought up the thing like searching for Salai, but actually, a lot of news channels are doing this now where they're leveraging a lot of true crime dramas that tell that longer than 2 minute story you may or may not get on the news. At best, a true expose on a news story might get you a 1 hour show follow up on the weekend, talking about in depth about a news story about something that happened in Liverpool in 2015. But you can really create these and put this kind of content out there much cheaper as well, more quickly, with telling true crime dramas and pulling viewers in with some ads as well. You should use employees to promote your audio content and your podcast. Absolutely, these are your best brand evangelists, your best influencers on the planet. Leverage them to use your audio. Is performance hard to measure with podcasting or audio? Absolutely, yes, it is. It depends on the perspective of this as well. The direct click through rates are somewhat manageable on some of the channels, but not all the channels are work together for a lot of reasons. Apple's moving in some of that direction with gated content as well, but not everything is it. You cannot figure out right now, for the most part, what the direct leads are always, or the direct number downloads on different podcasts, just from what you may see on Apple numbers or even what Chartable reports. The numbers are hard to measure. The attribution's a mess in general for most brands because you're omnipresent anywhere. But if they download it and they share it, if they pull it up on Stitcher versus Apple, whether or not they pull it directly from your website, unless you gate it only on your website, there's a pretty good chance it's going to be a hot mess trying to figure out how to measure it. You can get a general sense of it, but it's not the same. And I always want to say this just to say it out loud. It's not the same as just a click through rate on an ad. Now, voice search and voice SEO, extremely important, because if you ain't first, you're last. And this is important specifically with your Amazon and your Google devices. This is Ricky Bobby from the brilliantly ridiculous American made movie Talladega Nights, as he plays a race car driver. But if you ain't first, you're last. Again, this is going to be a problem in particular with audio for people looking at audio and who are not number one. When you ask your Amazon Alexa device, find yourself doing this. There are not that many times where you say, "Hey, Amazon, list out the three best products in my area that serve this, that, and the other." You're going to ask, "Hey, what's the local, what's the nearest pizza company?" Think of whatever you can think of, but generally you're asking a general question, not a specific numerical question where you're looking for options, but you're generally getting one answer back, and that answer can be triggered by a lot of different things. So you've really got to think of a way to niche, if you will, that differentiation with audio so that people know. I used to work for True Green, for example. True Green is synonymous for lawn care. But if you're at any other brand, and True Green owned over a third of the market nationally here in the US, that niche that they create, just as you find with any company, that more brand name where somebody's asking for True Green as opposed to asking for lawn care services, it can make a big difference in your search results. Identify those keywords. These are some of the basic tools that you can use. I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of these SEO tools, but really think of looking at these optimization tools for that audio reference and how you can narrow down your niche with those keywords. Think long tail conversational keywords. This is a thresher shark, which is one of my favorites with an extremely long whipping tail. But think of the conversational elements that you have rather than just saying a one word answer. So again, True Green's a branded example, but a non-branded example might be, you know, a lawn care that's in Liverpool near. I'm trying to think of a street address that I don't know in Liverpool, but I think you get the gist of what I'm trying to say. Think of something that's a conversational phrase that niches your brand more than just a generic non-branded keyword. Think conversations. Where can I best find the best flight costs to Denver, for example, or how do I get to the Colorado Rockies? What's the best pizza place near the Hyatt? Again, these are examples that we used last year when we were in Denver at the Lead Generation World inaugural show. But optimizing SEO for voice search, pay attention to those long tail keywords that make up that conversation that you voice. Sorry, and I jumped a couple here. Think customer intent. Again, as you think through those long tail keywords, restructure your content as you blog it. Take that audio content that we talked about, start with your top 10 ranking pages. That's going to help you as well. Continue to use the right type of audio devices. Optimize for snippets. And I'm running through these because I don't want to get us too late. But think of those audio snippets that you can create downloadable audio versions of your blog content. Again, not nearly enough people are doing this. Very few people take their blog content and create an audio version of it that can be consumed on something like an Amazon device. Wouldn't you love that a person would want to listen to your blog rather than read it? And if they were able to tell their Amazon device, would you go pull up the next Lead Generation World blog, today's blog from Lead Generation World, or however you want to structure it? Audio versions of ebooks, again, creating many books that are audio versions rather than just something that somebody downloads as a PDF, extremely important to you now. Again, I talked about lawn care, thinking of unique ways that you can take specific phrases, specific short books on how to fix customer problems can be great versions of audio that people will leverage. Again, I mentioned adding audio to your blog. There are readers that will read this for you if you're not even people that have accessibility issues know about this, but really look at creating an environment to where people can listen to your written word rather than just reading it. And now, what I really want you to start thinking about is localizing some of your audio content. Skyline downtown. This was something I thought I used, and I couldn't really come up with a better example than this one. But if you're thinking near me, a lot of the questions that are asked with your Google Maps or Waze or anything else are basically hyper local strategies looking at your local listings. So think of these, coffee. What's the coffee shop near me, near the Hyatt Hotel? or whatever it is. Think those hyper local strategies where you are in whatever city you're on when you're creating this kind of audio content as well. Appear on local podcasts. From an SEO standpoint, you don't have to be on the Joe Rogan Experience, which will get you better reach, with this millions of people in audience. But if you find 10 local podcasts that are all in uh, you know, Ireland, that are that's the audience you're serving, you're going to get a much better SEO lift than just appearing on Joe's more reachable content. I actually had the same question with a PR person. If you had the opportunity to be on one big show versus 10 local shows, even they said this from a PR standpoint, you're just going to get more of an SEO lift from those local shows. Encourage reviews from audio. This is one of the things I know it's hard for a lot of people to do, to get reviews on your product or brand. Half the time it's when people are complaining. Audio reviews, I get a few bad ones. I love them when I get them because I go back and I listen and I find what did I do wrong, what I need to improve. But most people are not saying nasty stuff about Joan Jett when they go to an audio podcast. They're giving you a generally positive reviews, and that's going to lift that. Use markup schema as well when you're creating that SEO lift from your audio content. um, think mobile optimization is what I wanted to get to. Make certain that specifically with audio, as you design your sites, that you really focus in on how does somebody consume that. We cover this all the time from other forms of content and from web design and UX, but really think about how is somebody going to consume that audio for you on their phone, whether it's on a blog, if it's on a podcast where you share it, can be as simple as point it not just to your website, but make sure you post it to Apple Podcasts or something like that. Target your audience. Again, this is, marketing and advertising in 101, but doing this, really creating audio content that serves that audience, will help trigger their ear, turn up their spidey senses more and more. Always be testing your audio content. Your audio content does not need to be like a stagnant ad that you run over and over. You can run limited series. I talked about, thinking about it from a podcasting standpoint, limiting the number of episodes to say 10 in a series. I think Netflix does a lot of series where there are 13 episodes. This is something that you can really leverage out different types of completely unique formats that are different than the others. Data behind the voices. Now, from having worked in performance marketing for a good chunk of my life, this is something that I don't think gets talked about nearly enough from a lot of audio folks who don't know anything about companies like this, and it drives me crazy. As a marketer who drove calls to a call center, looking at the types of technology that will help, one, trigger my ads to perform better. This is extremely important. The gold standard for me, and I love these guys because they're also now a sponsor of my show, Invoca. They've been the gold standard in the call intelligence space. I know the company. I worked with them for years. I've also worked with some of these other companies, and several of them are good too. I mean, there's quite a few of them that are out there, and this changes. The landscape changes all the time. But really leveraging call intelligence and taking the basically that first party conversation. Somebody, clicks on an ad, they go to your webpage, they fill out a form, a call center calls them. This happens all the time in home services, it happens all the time in insurance, it happens in all kinds of industries, higher education, things like that. But when that customer is on the phone with somebody, whether it's sales or a call center agent, that's first party data. That's your first party relationship with people. Taking that and using that transcripted, basically machine learning with things like Invoca does, for example, taking that to go tell Google and Microsoft Ads, this is where we need to perform well because people are saying the word lead generation world is triggering their interest more. That's the kind of where you can really leverage audio to drive better performance from a marketing standpoint and advertising standpoint. Again, I brought up transcriptions earlier. I'm not going to do it again, but this is again another way that this machine learning can make a real difference. I left out Alexa skills in particular, but you've got to start Alexa skill if you want people consuming these 3-minute type episodes daily. It's important. You want to be again that first place finisher for whatever that niched, branded term or non-branded, depending on how you play it. Um, but that we could devote a whole show just on Alexa. There's plenty of other things to talk about, though. That's why I wanted to talk about call intelligence tools, podcasting, things like this. But look, Amazon Alexa's the Echo devices are the best-selling products in history in technology, and so these products were out there for a reason. People are consuming a lot of basic skills, trying to figure out, how do I do this, how do I do that, tell me the stat of the day on this. These are the kind of skills where people are engaging with their Amazon or Google devices, and they can take advantage of creating audio content where they hear your voice. Maybe it's your CEO, maybe it's your customer service team, maybe it's some story you're telling in a very short form. These are great skills that you need to create. Why is this important to do now? Especially now, because we've had a lot of time over the last year. You got to be first. You got to be fast. This is fast flash content. Tips for creating great flash briefings. Look, these are easy to find. Amazon can walk you through a lot of this. I can walk you through a lot of this. This is easy to create these flash briefing skills. They're short form, they're easy to load. You can add it to your feed. It's fantastic. So, if seasonal, create seasonal flash briefings. This again was where I leverage my experience from working in the home services field, where a lot of business higher ed's the same way. Think of your audio content from being seasonal. Evergreen, yes, but evergreen in a seasonal standpoint. Are using audiograms. Wave and Headliner, if you're out there promoting some form of audio, especially podcast audio, make certain that you leverage creating waveform audio to grab people's attentions on social platforms. Again, this is another way you can combine the different things together to make it work. Perfect example. SAP created one about utilities, shows a waveform. This is where they post that. If you posted a general picture, I do the same thing on mine. I'm sorry, I was stopping that just because it was going to, I wasn't sure if it was picking up on the Zoom. But when you show those forms of audiograms, it gets people's attention. I'm going to try this again. It grabs people's attention just then, other than seeing a static ad, just like a video does. And it also transcribes in the bottom because most people's audio is off when they're looking at a social ad, unless they tip on the microphone. Another one that I'm very excited about that's been going on for almost a year and a half now is interactive voice ads. Pandora was the first to experiment with this, but really creating these interactive voice ads to where you're talking back to them. This is, again, not beta, but it's still early on, and this is very exciting about what we're able to do from an audio interactive. A say through rate is basically the way you have to think of it, sort of similar to a click through rate, but having an interactive ad where you can talk back through is really important. Are you optimizing with other media? This is extremely important. Burger King did this well, and it drove people nuts because they were one of the first to say on air to talk about Alexa in their commercial, and then it triggered everybody's Alexa across the world. I've probably done it if I've had yours on, and I'm sorry, but Burger King did this and started triggering people through TV ads to leverage the audio to trigger their Amazon device. Something you can think of in a way that is not necessarily intrusive and annoying. Be more restrictive. They were testing the waters early with this, but it's something that all of us are thinking about. Just ask Alexa, provide custom voice prompts. Again, this goes back to the niching. Provide something that is not just it's what Burger King did. It's basically providing something that's more specific than a generic key phrase like, show me people that use solar panels. Make it more niche than that. Now, I'd be remiss if I did not talk about Clubhouse. So Clubhouse is overwhelmed, and from a lead gen standpoint, if you are a coach, you will find a million coaches on Clubhouse. But Clubhouse has some very interesting ways that is not all extractable and downloadable yet, but really start thinking about Clubhouse from a lead generation standpoint as well. How do you create the kind of audio content and conversations that's going to make customers want to find you specifically on Twitter or Instagram, on those Instagram channels? Really, now you're starting to think about, how does not just how do you get leads extracted out of one social platform, but where does it drive traffic to that's clickable, and that can be done through your Instagram page, and that can be set up with, you can set this up with unique Instagram feeds that are not necessarily only your regular Instagram. One of the things that I've done with somebody is create a specific Clubhouse URL, because most people are driving from Clubhouse to Instagram, but not on the Instagram they're using. They're driving to a specific separate Instagram channel. And then that allows them to devote the kind of content that pulls them through a different funnel. So again, it's not 100% yet. This is still a lot in play, but it's very interesting to where we think about. So a few more eyes to think about. Think about also translating your written content. Again, I'm delivering this in English, but I'm always conscious of this because I speak several languages. Taking that kind of audience, don't lose out if you've got a heavy population that's French or Spanish or German. Make certain to translate that audio content. It's very easy to do. I'm talking about written transcripts, but taking that audio content, using a platform to transcribe over to another language, because that can help you from an SEO standpoint as well. Do not silo your audio efforts. Again, this is taking, maybe it's a video pillar of content. You strip out the audio, and there's your audio podcast, audio content, for example, but you also want to use that in your email campaigns and other campaigns across the board and with all the different teams as well. Continue that story across the channels, whether it's, you're talking about this kind of content on an audio form, you might also want to use that in a direct mail piece, or is it a social play, whatever it is. Just think about leveraging that across the channels. Introduce audio when appropriate. This is not meant to where we push every bit of audio in front of everybody all the time, so really think through that. Podcast live when you can. Make it interesting. Make this something that you didn't expect out of me on the 87th slide, as we're going to talk about podcasting live. Do something to where you pop out that you're podcasting live and you're picking up ambient noise, and you're carrying on conversations with people that don't think this is the same branded PowerPoint that you've seen 50 different times. Remind people to subscribe to your audio channel. This is extremely important because you want people coming back, and there are different notifications that are basically just like you find on a website that remind people to come back and subscribe all the time, to download your show, things like that. Ask for ratings and reviews, because just like SEO, ratings and reviews will prompt people. It's that social proofing we all need to get our podcasts more known and seen. It's part of the reason I have a ton of reviews, because I've been very aggressive about getting reviews. I have a ton of people that want to be on my show because they equate X number of reviews to X number of downloads and listens. And this is extremely important. It's easier to do. As I mentioned, people are not writing out nastygrams on Apple Podcasts about your audio quite like they would about your service on Yelp. So don't forget, with audio in particular, to tell a story. I live and breathe by performance marketing and lead generation, but this is done through the quality of a story, often with audio, not just typical click here, buy there. So again, my show is called a Shark's Perspective. My nickname is Shark. I often dive with sharks, and I spend most of my time in the water. I'm going to jump ahead a slide. You'll find a lot of the top names in marketing and advertising, many that you're familiar with. I see Leland Bullock, who's from England, actually now lives in Israel, down the bottom right. But Seth Godin, Ann Hanley, to Neil Patel, and so on and so forth. You know a lot of these names, but I post a show pretty frequently. I'm getting close to episode 300. The brilliant Mike Free has been on as well multiple times, and so looking forward to having him back on again, maybe when we talk about Contact.io. But big shout out and thank you to everybody. Big shout out and thank you to Mike for putting this together. I think this is absolutely brilliant. We talk about this all the time in the States, but it's so good to bring this kind of conversation, well, for you at the crack of dawn, for the rest of us, any time of the day.
Yeah, no, I'm telling you, this is one of those sessions that, thank God, it's recorded, so you can go back and look at different things that you provided, because you provided so much information and detail to some of these topics that I was also thinking, like, man, that was a session, that was a session, that's a session. Like,
well, and I looked at my phone and I wanted to apologize, because I was like, this went longer than I thought we were going to do, but there's so
great
many ways to peel this apart over
Yeah.
and over.
before we wrap up, there was a couple
Yeah,
questions, and I'm going to
sure.
try to sort of wrap it into, I think, one. I can combine, I think, one of them, which is, when thinking about some of these companies that, in the Legion over in the UK, they're focused on insurance. They're
Sure.
all focused on remortgage, home services. Some of this stuff isn't so sexy, right? How do you, recommend, creating content for sort of those categories that aren't as, as sexy as maybe some other category?
Absolutely. So I also work as an influencer, and I have two sponsors. Uh, Half of my show, as you know, is talking about marketing and advertising, and then there's a lot of silliness because I'm a former failed stand-up comic, and but I dive with sharks as frequent as I can. So I talk about sharks and stuff like that all the time. It's very interesting to people. Talking to people about conversational texting and conversational intelligence platforms is not sexy. But when I talk about it for them, especially, and I say this from an influence standpoint, it allows me to tell their story in a better way, which is why during the pandemic, I had tons of people coming to me saying, we want to advertise on your show. And I held off as long as I could, but I wanted to be behind. So you can find an influencer in particular that has a broad reach and audience like I do and be able to tell that story in an impassioned way. Nobody wants to hear, and I use this example when I talk about Bob's accounting shop. Nobody wants to hear talk, even in the insurance industry. I don't want to hear somebody talking about insurance, life insurance quotes and things like that. But you can tell stories about Bob who needed an insurance policy. And here's the story about him and his family and where he needed this insurance to pay for this, that, or the other, so that his kid, Sally, wanted to grow up and be an astronaut one day. I mean, these all these things that you could weave around in a story format and then drop in the conversation about audio. It's contextual as opposed to just a straight ad saying, hey, come buy insurance. Nobody wants to hear that. And that has been where storytelling has really changed a lot of this. But there's so many ways to weave in to things that, again, conversational intelligence and conversational texting has nothing to do with an idiot like me that loves sharks. But the fact that I'm telling it in a story format and weaving it into my story makes it a lot different. And I think that's one of the differences that you see with TV ads as well. Nobody wants to watch, a basketball game on ESPN, and then all of a sudden you're seeing an insurance ad. But if it's a pizza ad for pizza, probably a better example, a pizza ad where somebody's watching the game, it's more contextual. It's something that basically, when you think of from a conversion rate optimization standpoint, it's another thing that helps trigger that context and drives a sale. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah,
But really,
absolutely.
I'll link the story together.
Absolutely. Well, I think to your point, it's not just about, talking about that specific category that you're in. It's about maybe talking about a bunch. There's probably a number of ideas that you can focus on that would be more entertaining than just talking about the nuts and bolts of,
Yeah.
you know,
Well, and that's
tractors.
that's where we have to be creative. It's not just blunt force marketing
Yeah.
anymore. The audiences have changed. I've had to change as well. But really thinking through that, I was able to see much higher lift. And that doesn't mean for my own show that most people are listening to it because they like sharks. That's not the point either. It's just being able to tell a story in a different way about SEO or PPC or lead gen or whatever it is. That's a little bit different than just in your face with that one individual topic only.
Yeah. So I think due to time constraints, we'll leave it at that. Anybody else has any conversations, they could reach out to you at Sharks, the Sharks Perspective, and or via the app here. Find you on LinkedIn, Kenneth Kinney, as well, and just take it from there. But I really appreciate you going through all this stuff. There's a lot of information there to be had and listened to. So yeah, there's your
Nope.
your
Yep.
info.
Sorry.
There it is. There's all the social media things for everybody to follow you on. But again, thank you very much, Kenneth. It was
Yeah.
a
Most
pleasure
welcome.
listening
Thank
to
you for
everything
putting
that's
this
happening.
together.
All right.
Look
All
forward to
right.
seeing
Thank
you
you,
again in
everyone.
person. All right, buddy.
Yes, absolutely. Take care.